Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is our first talk in a new season of exhibitions at ICA LA, and we're so happy that you've chosen to join us. My name is Ashley Pisa, and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here, and I welcome you. Currently at our museum, we have recently opened in our main galleries the exhibition titled The Inconstant World, a group show curated by our dear Senior Curator, Jamillah James. And in our annex space, we have a project by Paul Pescador titled PSA. We also have our field workshop Artists in Residence program with Sid Duenas, who started working on site this week. More public programs are coming, and please follow us or join us on our mailing list to keep informed. As museums reopen in Los Angeles, we're still getting back our footing, and we've worked really hard to keep going, and we thank our stalwart funders who have buoyed us during these challenging times. We continue to keep admission and our programs free of charge, and if you're able and inclined, please consider making a donation of any amount to our organization. If you're local, please consider making an appointment to visit us. Jamillah James will be moderating this panel of 3 of the 9 artists featured in our show, The Inconstant World, and I will share succinct versions of their bios now, and then I'll hand it over to Jamillah. So we have Liz Deschenes, who has exhibited or worked regularly since receiving a BFA in 1988 from RISD, Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, Rhode Island. The first comprehensive survey exhibition of her photographs, organized by Eva Respini, was on view at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston in 2016 and accompanied by a monograph published by Prestel. She's most recently mounted solo exhibitions at Miguel Abreu Gallery in New York and Campoli Presti, London and Paris. Her work is in the collections of the Walker Art Center, Minneapolis, Centre Pompidou in Paris, Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, DC, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, and the Solomon Guggenheim Museum in New York, all these in New York, the Milwaukee Art Museum in Wisconsin, ICA Boston, and San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Now we come to David Horvitz, if you haven't heard, is playful. There might be a crow in this event. David is an ocean romantic based in Los Angeles, and he meddles with the systems of language, time, and networks, hyper-paced Zoom calls, emails, and images transmitted through screens. David issues categorization, his expansive nomadic body of work, traversing forms of photographs, word of mouth and physical movement or distribution, artists' books, performances, memes, mail art, sound, rubber stamps, gastronomy, weather, travel, walks, and watercolor is presented through examining questions of distance between places, people, and time in order to test the possibilities of appropriating, undermining, or even erasing this distance. And you'll see this quite significantly in the piece that's in the show, which I'll talk about. Ingrid Olson lives and works in Chicago. And in 2010, she earned a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Olson's work has been included in group exhibitions at the Henny Onsted Kunstsenter, Hovogeden in Norway, Aspen Art Museum, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In 2017, Olson's work was featured in a 2-person exhibition at the Renaissance Society of Chicago, and in 2018, her work was the subject of a solo exhibition at the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, New York. And now we give it to Jamillah, who will begin this program. And that's it. Okay. I'm gonna hide away now.
Okay. Thank you, Aska, and hello, everyone. I'm Jamillah James. I'm Senior Curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. I want to thank everyone for joining us for our first program related to our current exhibition, The Inconstant World, which is on view through May 30th. So if you're in Los Angeles or coming to Los Angeles, please feel free to make an appointment to see this show in person. You could do so at the icala.org/visit. The exhibition features 9 international artists. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Features 9 international artists whose work examines the relationship between perception and abstraction, focusing on visibility and illegibility as artistic strategies. Each artist uses different modes of abstraction and consider the incomplete image or an attempt to represent that which cannot be captured or clearly articulated, often in relation to language or a physical body that is absent or represented in unexpected ways. With the body, language, and the experience of time as points of departure, the exhibition engages the limitations of representation and images as a site of interpretation. Today's discussion will delve into the ways in which the three of the artists that are featured in the Inconstant World, Liz Deschenes, Dave Horvitz, and Ingrid Olson, are approaching new and discursive models of photography and distribution and revisiting the medium's conventions and capacity as a representational tool. There will be an opportunity towards the end of the program for questions, so please enter them using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will answer a selection of these after the discussion. So now on to some images and additional remarks about each of our panelists. Oops. Always a learning curve with Zoom. Okay, so Liz Deschenes is known for her cameraless photographic processes through which she produces oblique and abstracted images, FPS 45, frames per second 45, a 45 panel work, which is included in the Inconstant World, is one of a series of photographs from this series that are made using ambient or moonlight, which appear to be metallic expanses of no discernible form, but encourage viewers to look a lot closer. Dashen, who has said that she is interested in the conditions of display literally being a part of the surface of the work, sometimes does not fix the light-sensitive surfaces of her photographs, allowing their surfaces to become subject to subtle changes over the course of an exhibition. She draws inspiration from the earliest exponents of photography, such as William Henry Fox, Talbot, and Louis Daguerre, and their still unperfected photographic processes, and Etienne Jules Mouret, whose experimentations with movement and time influenced the production of the FPS works that are on view. David Horvitz is a conceptual artist whose work takes many forms, as Oscar mentioned, through photography, performance, art books, conceptual websites, online interventions, and mail art, among many, many other different forms. We are presenting his work Nostalgia in the Inconstant World, which assembles a number of photographs from the artist's personal digital archive of daily snapshots documenting his life. Taking its title from the 1971 Hollis Frampton film of the same name, the work comprises a variety of images projected 1 minute each during the duration of the exhibition, taken by various digital cameras since the early 2000s. I'm also cycling through other works that we'll talk about a little bit later. For Nostalgia, after the photographs are projected, the files will be permanently deleted. Over the course of the exhibition, and our exhibition in particular, 18,600 images will be presented, then destroyed, corresponding to each minute that were open to the public over the course of the exhibition, for a total of 310 hours or 18,600 minutes. And lastly, Ingrid Olson uses photography, sculpture, drawing, and architectural interventions to explore how her body and each viewer's body relates to the boundaries of space and what is visible. The interrelationships and slippages between photographic and sculptural elements are central to her work and challenge the experience of architectural space and embodiment and refuse immediate recognition. Her carved and cast sculptures, such as Mothers, which is an 8-part relief sculpture that was produced for the Inconstant World, are cast from molds or carved from a design in relation to the physical body. The installation of these abstract forms correspond to the height and of a specific person and are imprinted with a sense of intimacy, but remain distanced from the conventions of figuration and our relationship to images. So I want to say a warm welcome to Liz, Ingrid, and David as we start this conversation. Okay, so I'm going to start with Ingrid first, because of the three of you, you're the one who is perhaps the most directly engaged with photography as we know and understand it, the use of a camera, the printing, framing, and presentation of photographic images. Still, you're constantly shifting the boundaries of what constitutes an image and the forms that an image might take, and extend your practice to encompass sculpture as well. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you go about constructing a photographic image and why presenting a fragment is central to your work.
Um, well, first, I want to say thank you for including me in the photographic section, even though I have a sculpture, like a more sculptural work in the exhibition. I think it allows me to kind of talk about the slippage between the two. But I do use actual traditional film to make the images, so it is probably like the most traditional. It's not digital. But yeah, they're basically like just studio constructions in which I'm thinking about kind of disrupting the way that space is experienced. I think a lot about, it's like a very simple relationship, but almost like tunnel books, like foreground, middle ground, background, and kind of flattening them all together or conflating them in some way that abstracts the way that you see the space that I'm picturing.
Got it. I read an interview with you in Objective magazine in 2018, where you discussed the positioning of the viewer vis-a-vis your photographs and also your objects, and that they don't allow an immediate access. They deny entry or even forcibly kick the viewer out, which I thought was an interesting idea. The way that you use cropping or how you don't show yourselves in the photographs or how the sculptural reliefs are fragmentations of a body, but kind of distorted a little bit further, run counter to how so much of what we understand of images, especially at this moment. So for you, why has embracing this distance between yourself and the viewer been important?
I think long answer probably, but I think it does kind of bridge some element of the illusionistic sense of going into an image, whether that be painting, photographic, these kind of things. But the moment that it becomes more sculptural, I think that's the moment that it kind of kicks you out and you realize that you are outside of that space and it can't be as mental as an image sometimes can be when it's fully illusionistic. But I think it stemmed from like the very first moment of my taking photographs. And I think just from a feminist perspective of kind of oscillating between subject object and wanting to kind of like shift that and make people aware of their looking. So yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because you say that, you know, including you in this conversation about photography, even though you do have sculptural objects in the exhibition. I mean, there is a clear relationship, I think, talking about the subject-object relationship. At what point did sculpture become a useful approach for you, and why did you start making these reliefs?
The reliefs actually stemmed out of a found object in a studio many studios ago. That was like a carved pencil tray. It was very small, but to me, it was just when I had kind of become infatuated with photography in general. Having not studied it, I was just thinking about all of the mechanisms of it and the kind of, I guess, the materials involved with it, what like the kind of like very base materials involved with it. But this object looked like the crosshairs of a camera. It just had an X in it, but it was just so. So I don't know, there was something that I recognized in it, but it had these little kind of inward curved recesses that would hold a pencil. But I looked at it and when I flipped it up, I was like, oh, this is perfect. It's like a little version, but it feels like something that you could impress yourself into. And so from there, that was kind of like the progenitor of all of the relief series. And it still stems out of something that's photographically minded to me. It just feels like the inverse, because most often these sculptures they almost look like molds or something. They are inverted curves, but they are designed to make shadows, to make an image. So they're kind of the opposite of like photography is supposed to be drawing with light. So to me, these feel like drawing with shadow because they're changeable depending on where they are, how they're lit. If there's natural light, they change throughout the day. So they do feel like they can have the element of being unfixed in a different way than the photographs tend to.
Yeah, with the changing of the light throughout the day, the shadow gets changed also the changeability of how the works are installed. You had instructions to install the work based on the body of the person that's installing it. So there's this connection between you as a producer, but also the people or the person that might be involved with the installation of the sculpture. But then also the space itself becomes an actor in this as well, because of the relationship of the object to the space and how it transforms.
Mm-hmm. I do feel like there's like I mean, that instruction booklet is long and it's all these like,
I loved it. It was fantastic.
Kind of crazy, but it's like there's certain stipulations that I feel like when you're setting something up, you have parameters for something in which you feel like they're important. And then I think there's the moment, and so often for me, like the beginnings of things are the moment of freedom. And there's this, you know, there's the sketchiness, there's the like intuitive quality of the way that I take photographs, or the sketches that then later become refined designs that become the sculptures. But this multi-part work and this kind of series that is just newer than the rest, it feels like a way to kind of relinquish control again and kind of let the works live in a way that I can't anticipate. And I think like it's, I don't know, it's just interesting to have those parameters that you want, and then the ones where you say, do whatever you want, like forcibly. So.
Yeah. And what do you think the sculptures do that the photographs don't?
I think it goes back to probably that idea of illusionistic space maybe that I mentioned, but I do think like photographs feel like a narrowing to me. They're like a cropping and a very specific selection of whatever you want to be viewing or presenting. At least my kind of, not my kind of photographs, not Liz's, you know, but like, you know, where there's like they're not material, they're an image, they're illusionistic. But I think the sculptures wind up being more oblique and kind of an opening up into the space and kind of including the floor, wall, ceiling, everything around it, the light. So yeah, they're more oblique, I think.
Yeah, I would also agree with that. And that will take me to Liz now. Some individual questions for you. You're also someone whose work occupies this space between photography and sculpture, but you remove the representation of the body altogether. Your first photograms were produced around 2003 and have become a major component of your practice. You've also explored several early photographic modes, such as the zoetrope and the stereograph, as well as the materiality of photographic production and the speculative possibilities of certain techniques like green screen. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about at the point that you decided that the camera was no longer viable for you, and what that revelation was like.
I think a lot like what Ingrid just described. It's sort of the inverse. Even though the camera isn't there, it's referred to, and it's even referred to in some of the titles that I use. Like you put up Tilt Swing, which used a drawing that Herbert Bayer did in the 1930s. It never got actualized. And I took that drawing and made all sorts of liberties. Like I expanded it. I took out the viewing platform. I made the possibility of people being inside the work or outside of the work as opposed to being contained in the work. But I titled it Tilt Swing because that's the operation of the camera that corrects for perspective. So even though there's not a camera present, it's referred to, I hope, to allow for the viewer to find, themselves in the position of making decisions about how they view the work. Because when one is making work, obviously there's this multiple vantage points. And there's, the desire for me to transfer that on to the viewer. So even though there's not a camera present, it sort of becomes omnipresent by my reference and its absence. So it's sort of a myriad of things at the same time. It's not like, oh, stopped using a camera, and I think that's something I'm sort of adverse to even hearing, because I never stopped using cameras. You know, they became expanded into rooms. You know, they became expanded into the idea of like being a viewfinder, and hopefully, as I said, opening up possibilities for viewing.
Yes. The viewer is, you know, an active participant in the looking at your work, and the viewer's experience of space and time as they encounter the work. Your process is very much also about how time is imprinted on the surface or in the production of the work. And for the work that's in the exhibition from the Frames Per Second series, it's also referenced in the title itself. The work becomes animated as the viewer moves around it. Each piece is installed at a specific interval, and the panels demand quite a bit of attention from the viewer in order to see the subtleties of the work. How do you reconcile these distinct experiences of time across from your process of production to how the viewer interacts with the work and to the life of the object as it's on view?
That's an interesting question, because I was thinking about it earlier, like, and this might sound really abstract, but I'm interested how time can be measured through photographic materials. And I think you've asked us all to think about sort of, the ambiguity that can be embedded in abstraction, and how do you measure time through photographic materials? Well, you can't. I mean, you can to a certain degree that, that these materials will change, and, and to a certain degree, me and conservationists can determine somewhat some of this change. But it's not quantifiable. That's a word I was looking for. So I'm interested in that abstraction, how you can measure time through materials and through obviously viewing.
And in terms of your materials, could you speak a little bit about the choices that you're making, especially like the exposure of the photograms in particular, and like the marks that end up on the surface, and what you'd like for people to see and what you're okay with people not seeing?
I leave all the marks of making the work. And making anything that large scale obviously leaves all the labor in it, so that's an important thing for me to leave in the work, regardless if people are aware of it. The making of becomes the imprint into the work. So you can see all the folds of the paper, you can see the paper folding back on itself, you can see every time it's touched, handled, and part of this was in response to the expectations of photography. And I thought that was another nice question that you posed to us, that the expectations of photography are that it be seamless, and it be able to have this long lifespan, which is interesting, as so many people work with fugitive materials, like Ingrid. I noticed that you work with slide material, like that inherently will change and alter. So this expectation is in contrast to what the materials actually do propose.
Yeah, it's an interesting proposition, because there is this push and pull between what we know and understand of the process and the materials, and what someone might see or understand of the materials, which there's room for a lot of misunderstanding, I think, or your work is often spoken about in relation to minimalism, particularly its form and its relation to physical space. There are aspects such as the role of chance and the unpredictable nature of your materials that undercut that to some degree. It also introduces a consideration about authorship and artistic imprint on the work. Where do you see what is the sense of your work, how it might complicate a clear understanding of authorship given its resistance to fixity?
That's a complicated question. A couple of years ago, I did an exhibition of works that had changed and altered in ways that, in a variety of ways, and I consider it sort of a reauthoring of the work, exhibiting works, that maybe some I hadn't seen in 10 or 15 years. And some changed, because they had been stored incorrectly, and some changed because they had actually been damaged. So in exhibiting these, it was a way of sort of, embracing, what had happened, with outside of the exhibition zone. So that, there's obviously, that time and space, and then there's the time and space of storage. And there was time and space of collection. So it was a way of sort of considering or reconsidering all of those possibilities.
Yeah, and considering that the object, once it leaves the studio, takes on its a whole other life of its own that, none of us are, well, I mean, as a curator, I'm supposed to like help control the circumstances, but, it gets a little bit murkier for artists, as things are circulating in the world. Which brings me to David and questions of circulation. Yes, hello. Your project as an artist has continually challenged the channels of distribution for images, and also how you are represented in the world. There's a number of ongoing works like Mood Disorder and Public Access, which are interventions into the peer-sourced resource Wikipedia, which then becomes an engine for illustrations across the web, and everything just kind of slips away from that. The context of the images that you make are constantly changing and resist being static. Could you talk a little bit about these projects kind of as background, and how they may have set the stage for a project like Nostalgia, which we have on view at the museum? And a follow-up to that will be, what do you see as problematic in how images are circulated online? Or is there a problem? Unmute yourself. There we go.
All right, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
I'll start with Mood Disorder. Mood Disorder, just to give a brief summary, it was a photograph that I made. I'm like looking like this. I'm like modeling it after stock images of depression. And I made that kind of self-portrait. It was the far Rockaways early in the morning. And that was put on the Mood Disorder website on Wikipedia, and was from there began to circulate off of Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is a copyright-free platform. And so basically anyone who wanted to legally use a stock image, they have the rights to use it from Wikipedia. And they would then, so anyone who needed an image of depression would then pull it from there. And so for me, it was like almost like casting a seed in the wind and kind of like watching it grow and seeing what happens. Because I have, from the moment I put the image up, I make the image and I put it up, then I have no control as to what happens. And potentially nothing could happen. But in that circumstance, like the right, I mean, and thinking of like the metaphor of a seed, like the right conditions were ripe for germination. And then the image started to just kind of move around and pop up in various websites. I think you showed a screenshot from
InfoWars, yeah.
That wasn't me. And then using like reverse image searches, I was able to see where they ended up. And then, and so there's also a question as to like how do you define the parameters of the work? Like, where does the work end? Where does it start? For me, I don't really have an answer, because it's like, oh, all this stuff is happening, and all of this can get repackaged into the work. And then it grows even more, so it could then continue to grow and continue to change form. If you've seen my website, it's just audio text of kind of stories. So in a sense, there are these kind of stories about the works that are continuously changing. And that, then you wanted me to go through nostalgia, or?
Yeah.
So nostalgia is I guess there were images I was making with point and shoot digital cameras. I think I started like probably like around 2002 when I was an undergrad, a photo student at UC Riverside. And it was just this habit of like snapshot photography that I just had, but I had no interest in displaying these images, but I would just be in the world in my life, just making photographs that would just pile up on hard drives, folders and folders. And this is pre-phones. And so then once like cell phones came out with cameras, I started using that. And then it kind of like, it just started growing. And it was this almost this kind of, I always call it like this form of anxiety that was kind of like looming in the background. Is like, what do I do with all of these images? And the Nostalgia Project was a way for me to, I don't know, come to terms with this like archive that I didn't know what to do with, that I was like, I'll just, in a sense, kind of like bring it to life for one last moment and then let it burn out, like in the Hollis Frampton film, Nostalgia. Also obviously related to nostalgia in the sense of looking at these images of the past. But then it was like to experience the work, the viewer is having a unique experience with a very specific image that will then no longer exist. And so in a sense of like the mood disorder image was the same image kind of just circulating around. And it's like this, it's literally the same one. Whereas the kind of opposite is nostalgia. It's when you see it, you only see that one and then it's gone.
Yeah. So it's an interesting inversion between like this thing that now has a life of its own and those other images from the public access project that have a life of their own, independent of you as an artist. Whereas nostalgia is this entity, this like glut of images that you have that'll, now you see it, now you don't. It therefore and then it goes away. To that point, it seems like nostalgia is like an active refusal of having an archive, maintaining a series of images, or even trying to articulate a lived experience or a biography through pictures and what you see and encounter in the world. Some of the works like Nostalgia, and there's other projects as well that unfold in 1-minute intervals. You talked about your website, how it's this refusal of images. You don't see images on your website unless you download your entire website. You just get, which I did, you get like these narrations of the work and these descriptions of the work. So I'm wondering if you would characterize your project as an artist, or at least these specific works, as acts of refusal or an experience of loss or something else altogether.
Well, specifically for my website, I made that intentionally. So basically the website is a list of my works. You can click on it and you get an audio file of someone reading like a couple minute description of it. Or you could like download the text. And I specifically did that because I didn't want to make a website that someone could just click through in 2 minutes. It's like, oh, who's this artist? Click, 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 click. Okay, I got the idea. Let's go to the next artist. So it was like a refusal at that, and making someone have to spend time, have to like dive into it if they wanted to, or just, skip over it and be like, oh, I can't deal with this. I don't have 3 minutes to listen to this person rambling about this thing. I mean, the same with if you look, it has my birth date, and
yes.
if you change, I don't remember technically how it works, but I think if you change the IP address or you wait, the birth date changes. And that was just me being kind of playful and like mischievous, but also like playing with this notion. A lot of times when people like look at artist bios, it's like the first thing they go for is the year, so that they can like place them. I was like, oh, young and up and coming, or like mid-career. And it was like, I just kind of wanted to mess around with that. So you got false information. And then also letting that circulate on the web. And then, so if you were to write my bio, you might just pull it from somewhere else. And then that citation would be citing something wrong. Whereas you just emailed me and you're like, give me your real, give me the real one.
But I don't believe it's the real one.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the only people who know is if you have to book me a flight, then I have to send you my ID.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting the ways in which you're playing with what are the conventions of this field and the expectation of information about artists and who they are, what they do, and how they present their work, and how that work can therefore be commodified, et cetera, et cetera. You're just kind of standing in the way of that and slowing the person down that's coming to your work. Which I think is really important. And that's kind of what the conceit of this entire exhibition is about, is slowing down the viewer just a little bit. My last question for you, David, before I open up to kind of the group exchange and then to Q&A, would be about your sustained engagement with the mundane or the ordinary in your work, even with your object-based work, like the installations of water bottles or vases or the neon sculptures that are a word or a sentence. They're connected to the everyday or returning to something time and time again, and the outcomes still remain unpredictable. There is the argument, of course, about how art becomes art, artistic intention, the distinction between creative genius and what artists are doing when they're not actively making work. Where would you situate yourself in your practice in terms of how you decide when a project is a work or when it's just part of your day-to-day?
So hard. I mean, it's like sometimes something might turn into a work like years later, like this crow at the window. But yeah, I mean, I think like the everyday is also rooted in photography, and especially what I was describing before, where the images of nostalgia is coming from, is just this daily habit of making images. And it's just engaging in the world and like looking and being present and giving attention to like everything. I would also say you could maybe categorize me as having like a kind of post-studio practice, even though I'm in a studio right now.
Yeah.
But so it's like being outside, being in public, like being in the street, and like kind of making everyday life present in your work.
Yeah, it's super important. And, you know, even especially like right now, having that flexibility and that dexterity to kind of do different things at different times, I think is really important. So I have some general questions for the three of you. And then in the last 10 minutes, we can do Q&A with any audience questions. What would you identify as perhaps the pros and cons of increased access to image making or photographic technologies and means of distribution in relation to images? Very broad, very big question, but curious to hear your thoughts.
Pros, access, so that people can author their own stories.
I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important. That I mean, I think that's part of my, concern about images is, who gets to, place where they go and say what they want about them. So I think the pros are people being able to author, their own sentiments.
I think something that happens with inundation is probably a con in my mind. But I think there's something that happens with inundation where it becomes a form of literacy or like building a new understanding of something. And I feel like because there are so many images, I think that people are probably more able to read images in a different way than ever before, and kind of make new meaning. I don't know. Question.
Also in terms of like attention, like degradation of attention. I forgot to address this when you asked about 1 minute, but one of the reasons my images are projected for 1 minute is, even though it seems so short, it's like a moment, it is actually really long to look at a single image, especially if it's a banal snapshot.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I look at the nostalgia work, I actually get really relaxed, because it's like, oh, I don't look at images for this long anymore. Like, you're on your phone, you might look at like 300 images in like a couple minutes, and you're not actually looking. So maybe the con is like you forget how to look, or I guess there's this new kind of looking.
Yeah, the interesting thing about nostalgia in particular, David, is when you are tasked with looking at that image for a minute, especially, you know, at the start of the day at the museum, there's this tendency for, I think, of you to think that something is wrong or something is broken because it's not moving.
Yeah.
Or, you know, some confusion about what the content of the work is because there is this kind of stop, you know, measure where you're being asked to look at something for an extended amount of time, and you're not sure, you may not be sure what the thing is that you're looking at, and that there is, you know, some subtle change. Like with some of the images in nostalgia, I've seen that like it's like a different exposure, or something has moved to the left a little bit. So it's asking these questions of the viewer that I think sometimes there's some reticence to do.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Just Liz, I want to go back to a comment that you made earlier about an ambiguity towards abstraction. And I want to open that up to everyone else about what your orientation to the idea of abstraction is, how it bears out in your own practices, and how effective or powerful is it as a tool in your work, or more broadly?
I think I tangentially addressed it. I think this is, I'd like to hear what David and Ingrid think about it. Be good to have a conversation.
Yeah.
Do you consider them abstract? Because in a sense that they're like, it's like they're marks of, it's like, you know,
Well, I think for you in particular, it's not, but it's this abstraction of the experience of an image, and how we encounter images in the world, and the fact that there is this erasure that happens that, you know, completely changes how the image works.
I think I couldn't have said that better. I'm going to have you respond to these questions in the future, because the abstraction, you know, thing comes up all the time, and obviously I don't consider work to be abstract at all, but experience absolutely is, you know, and that's where the ambiguity comes in, is through the actual experience of the work, which is why I talked about, you know, the sort of absurdity of measuring, you know, time through photographic materials. You know, it's not quantifiable. It's completely abstract, and that's where my interest lies. And, you know, to answer your question, David, I think that, you know, there's not this line of like where something becomes abstract. You know, I think that, you know, the act of making is an abstraction.
Ingrid, do you have anything you'd like to say?
I get notifications on my computer, so I can make things. I think a lot about abstraction. I don't know if I have anything like great to say about it, but it comes across in like a lot of different choices that I make in the work. And I think it's like, even from like the film that I choose, it's something that I misuse, and it's like a slide film that I cross-process. I don't know how to stop this. I'm very technologically literate, I'm sorry. But in cross-processing, it essentially kind of makes certain planes, like it feels like a painterly gesture to me, where it makes certain planes of the space or clothing into kind of masses, like you would just put blue somewhere. So that's something that I'm definitely interested in terms of like eliminating detail, which is also very present in the sculptural works. And I think there's something about, I think I'm interested in like minimalism and those kind of moments, but kind of putting a subject back into minimalism and using minimalism as a form of abstraction. So yeah.
Question.
No.
Let's talk about language and text and narrative in your work and the relationship of language to your work. Or we could go to a Q&A question.
I like the language question.
Okay.
I mean, I think about structures and systems all the time as a way of kind of like bouncing against something. And language isn't very present in the end work, like visibly, other than the titles very often. But as a kind of beginning source, I think a lot about like antonyms and kind of this way of middling antonyms or something, where it's like there's a way of making them coexist in some way. Whether it's like up, down, left, right, cold, hot, close, far, like those kind of moments of like the very basic ones, but I don't know, the way that they can coexist in one piece might be something that sparks one work. Yeah.
Liz?
I use language to hopefully, give viewers a way into the work. When you talked about subjectivity, of the viewer, I think that the titles, and I think that diagrams from historical references, give the viewer a path in potentially, so they're not free floating. I think, not giving somebody a map, but giving them maybe a parkour, that there is a place for them in the work. And I think I've often used language to navigate that space.
Maybe you could say like impressions, almost like the moonlight is impressing itself onto the paper, and these kind of languages, like text, kind of impressing a kind of sensibility.
Yeah, I know. I think that's true. I don't think people are always aware of what they're seeing in real time. The same way I don't think artists are always aware of what they're making in real time. I think impression is fine, because that sort of suggests you're like an accumulation of experiences that I think we can all understand. That knowledge is cumulative. That viewing is cumulative. So I think that's something that would actually all share.
And I guess I'll respond to the question. I mean, very literal. I very literally like to use language in my work. I sometimes consider myself like a writer artist, like not a writer, but like I write and then it kind of manifests into artworks. I have a version of Nostalgia that's an artist book, and it's just one sentence descriptions of some of the photos that have been deleted. And so you could read that, and obviously most people would have never seen those photos, so you might get an impression of an image in your head, which is obviously different from the actual photograph that was taken and then projected and deleted. But they're all super, super simple, like oyster shells on the beach in Morro Bay or something. I made that one up. But yeah. Sorry.
We have a question from the audience from Thomas Houston. The question is in relation to the question about abstraction. I'm curious to know how each of the artists understand their work in relation to the index, could be of time, body, light, emotion, etc.
I'm going to turn it back on the person who asked the question. Which experience are they most interested and hearing about the in relationship to, because obviously, the index can be as simple as like a footprint in sand, or much more complex. I'm interested in them maybe being more specific about the question, if they could. Like what?
Thomas, if you're still there,
Sorry.
do you want to add a little bit more info about your question? Or maybe it's about the archive, I guess, or how things are collated in the work. Not sure. No one has an answer to it. Well, maybe what we can do then is, if you each have questions for each other, maybe this would be a good time to ask those.
I had like a thought, and I don't even know if it's a question, but I was just really struck by the fact that all of our work takes such different forms and approaches to things, but yet as we're talking about things, there was a lot of circling around, like a loss of control almost, or like a decentering and just kind of like a scatter, or these kind of, and I think each has a different approach to it. But I don't know. That was something that I was really struck by.
Yeah, I kept on thinking, I agree with you, and I kept on thinking about it as sort of like an interruption, sort of a defiance, interruption, a pause, and I would agree with you. It's arrived at in distinct ways, but certainly there's a lot of correlations.
I'm still thinking about.
Oh.
All right, no, I'm still thinking about the index question.
I mean, we could go into the archive if you want. Obviously, with nostalgia, it's an archive that is constantly being erased, and also still growing in the sense that I still make pictures with my phone. And then it becomes super self-conscious feedback where I'm like, am I making this picture to delete it? It's like, no, I'm photographing this because I have to remember the thing I need to remember. But it's like, yeah, it's like for me, it was a way of, it's like, what is this? Like, what is this archive of, I mean, not even the archive, but this archive of digital images that everyone now has. And like, it's almost like this digital side, like second life body that exists of this life that was lived, and it's in these kind of fragments of impressions of the world.
You, David, I've never seen this work in person. Does it play, I don't know, works, I don't know, switch chronologically? Like, is it like 7:24 and then 7:27 and then the next day and then the next day? Or does it cycle? Or
it's not it's kind of out of order. Like I make folders for each day, but it is sequential in terms of file naming. And so there could be image 1, 2, 3 and image 1, 2, 4, and maybe 1, 2, 4 was actually shot 5 years before, because when you're making so many images, they keep like cycling back into the file naming. So, but I intentionally wanted it to be like scattered, because I was also thinking about the viewer, that maybe it'd be more interesting if it was kind of random, and also like imagine in terms of like the body and memory. Like when you think in memory, it's not so like, it's not a linear line, but you're like, oh, that time here and there in New York, the Chinese restaurant, and then the miso.
I do think that's when we're thinking archives. No, like that's why I asked that question, because my thought about the idea of an archive is that it's something that's like a network rather than something that's static. And I feel like that's at least the way that I'm like coming to think about my own images and then just like archives in general. I think there's a sense of like non-linearity, the way that we're understanding time and cycles, or time kind of like referring back to, or memories, whatever. But I'm glad to hear that it's a little randomized.
Do you all have more questions for each other? If not, we can draw the program to a close.
I have one for you.
I'm leaving.
I love that you assembled this, you know, in this particular moment. Like, I presume this wasn't a show that you would have done before the pandemic, or was there an inkling of, actually, was there an inkling of this exhibition before the pandemic?
You know, it's an interesting question, and I think I can also fold this back on y'all in terms of like how this past year has impacted your work, or how your body relates, or you want viewers to relate to it, so on and so forth. But with this show, I mean, there's been so much movement at museums in the last year with trying to, you know, make up for lost time with the closures and moving things around. And there was an opportunity to realize an exhibition in the midst of this, in addition to everything that had been programmed before. And, you know, you spend an entire year not doing the things that you're used to doing, not seeing people, not being in the same physical space with people, not seeing art in person. And with this exhibition, I wanted to think a lot about how the experience of art is difficult in moments when you can't physically be there. And this is an experience that people have that, you know, live in different parts of the world, you know, can't go to every exhibition in the world. So you're relating to things as images, or in 360. And it's an approximation, but it's not the real thing. And I really wanted to assemble a group of artists who are really engaged in resisting a little bit of how someone might enter into the work, or it demands a slowness or a more deliberate approach to what someone is seeing. So the show is like very spacious, you know, everyone has their own kind of confined space, but it really demands like a in-person engagement. And I think that is a symptom of kind of coming to grips with how this year has been for all of us, you know, globally experiencing loss or experiencing, you know, a distance that we're unused to, I think, particularly in this field, which is very social. And, you know, people are running around and seeing shows and traveling. I mean, the last normal experience I had was being at the Armory show last spring, and then flying home from that. And then 5 days later, it was the lockdown. So just like looking at how, you know, our movements in the world can be interrupted, and how artwork also poses a similar experience with stopping someone, slowing someone down, and demanding attention in only the way that being together in physical space can.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, well, this has been fun. I'm so honored to work with all of you on this exhibition, and also to be in conversation with you today. Thank you so much for being fantastic artists and very generous and open to spend your afternoon or your evening with us on the occasion of the exhibition, The Inconstant World, which will be on view through May 30th. There'll be 2 more talks of this nature with the other artists in the exhibition, so stay tuned. Sign up for our mailing list through the ICALA.org. Follow us on social media to stay attuned to what we're up to. And if you're in LA, come by and see the show. I might be a little biased. I think you should definitely come down and see it. So you can make an appointment at the ICALA.org/visit. I want to say a special thank you again to Ingrid Olson, David Horvitz, and Liz Deschenes, to all of you, to Oscar Hisa and Adam Lee, my colleagues, for holding it down with the tech stuff. This will be recorded and available online in due time. So if you'd like to revisit this conversation again, you can. Thank you everyone for attending, and keep in touch and have a good night and be safe. Thank you.